Steve Harvey fired back at a racist player who refused to shake his hand, and what happened next shocked the world. In a moment that lasted mere seconds, the beloved host faced a choice that would define his career. With millions watching, Harvey stood at the crossroads of entertainment and integrity. The tension in that studio was palpable as cameras captured a confrontation nobody saw coming. But it wasn't just what Steve said. That diet was the extraordinary chain of events that followed. Family Feud has always been known for its light-hearted atmosphere, families competing in good fun, while Steve Harvey's charismatic hosting keeps everyone smiling. The colorful set, the upbeat music, the infectious laughter at a formula that made the show a beloved staple in American living rooms for decades. That's what made this particular episode, filmed on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday in Atlanta, so unsettling and out of place. From the moment contestant Mike Reynolds stepped onto the stage with his family, something felt off. While the Reynolds clan had sailed through the audition process with their energetic personalities and quick wit, Mike's demeanor stood in stark contrast to his relatives' enthusiasm. The production assistants noticed at first this reluctance during the pre-show briefing, the way he barely participated in the family's practice rounds. Throughout the game, Mike's responses to Steve were clipped, his body language stiff and unwelcoming. When Steve cracked jokes that had the audience roaring, Mike remained stone-faced. When his family members celebrated winning points, Mike offered only the most perfunctory high fives. The other family members exchanged uncomfortable glances as the tension slowly built, with Mike's sister even whispering something in his ear during a commercial break that seemed to do nothing to thaw his icy demeanor. The opposing family, the Johnson, sensed the strange atmosphere too. What should have been a fun competition began to feel like something else entirely, with unspoken currents running beneath the surface of the game. Camera operators zoomed in on Mike's scowl when he thought no one was watching, capturing footage that would later become crucial evidence in the court of public opinion. When Mike's family won the fast money round by a single point, everyone erupted in celebration, everyone except Mike. His family jumped and hugged each other, genuinely surprised and elated by their unexpected victory against the strong Johnson family. The confetti fell, the signature Family Feud music played, and Steve Harvey moved toward them with his characteristic showmanship. As customary on the show, Steve approached the winning family, extending his hand to each member with his trademark warm smile. One by one, they shook it enthusiastically, Mike's father gripping Steve's hand with both of his own, his mother giving a little curtsy along with her handshake, his sister practically jumping with excitement. The studio audience clapped along with each congratulatory gesture, until he reached Mike. In a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Mike looked directly at Steve's outstretched hand and deliberately put his own hands in his pockets. The move was calculated, unmistakable in its intention. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding, just a clear rejection that hung in the air between them. The studio fell silent. The cameras caught every excruciating second of Steve's expression, shifting from confusion to dawning realization. 20 years in comedy and television had prepared him for hecklers, for mistakes, for technical difficulties, but not for this naked display of disrespect with racial undertones on what should have been a joyful family game show. For 3 painful seconds, Steve stood there, hand extended, as the reality of what was happening registered on his face. The director frantically signaled to the camera operators, unsure whether to cut away or keep rolling on this unprecedented moment. Mike's family members froze, their celebrations halting mid-gesture as they realized what was happening. Mike himself stood with a slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, seemingly satisfied with the disruption he'd caused. But what happened next would shock everyone in the studio and change Steve Harvey's career forever. For a man who built his career on quick comebacks and perfect timing, those 3 seconds of silence seemed like an eternity. The studio audience held their collective breath, the usual background murmurs completely absent as the tension mounted. Network executives watching the live feed from their glass-walled offices in Los Angeles reached for phones, already calculating the potential fallout. The show's longtime producer, Marsha Livingston, who had been with Family Feud through 3 different hosts, pressed her hand to her mouth in disbelief. And Steve Harvey, a man who had risen from homelessness to become one of America's most beloved entertainers, who had slept in his car during his early comedy days, who had built an empire on his authentic connection with audiences, made a decision that would define not just his career, but his legacy. He slowly lowered his hand and took a deliberate step back from Mike. The movement was subtle yet powerful, creating physical distance without sacrificing his commanding presence. His eyes, usually crinkled at the corners with laughter, were now steady and penetrating. Then, with the composed dignity that had become his hallmark through decades of public life, Steve turned to face the cameras directly, adjusting the custom suit that had become part of his signature look. "You know, in my 15 years hosting this show, I've met thousands of contestants," Steve began, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight that resonated through the studio. People from every background, every walk of life, farmers from Nebraska, teachers from Oregon, doctors from Florida, mechanics from Detroit. And the beautiful thing about Family Feud is that when folks come on this stage, we all just playing a game together. We all just family for these 30 minutes we share. Steve paused, adjusting his suit jacket, a gesture familiar to his regular viewers, a move he often made before delivering a punchline. But there was nothing routine about what came next. The cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing a moment of raw authenticity rarely seen in daytime television. So when someone can see past the color of my skin to shake my hand, well, that says a whole lot more about them than it does about me. His voice didn't rise in volume, but somehow it filled every corner of the studio. "I've been black my whole life. I'll be black tomorrow. And I've learned that how people treat you says everything about their character and nothing about your worth." The studio erupted, not in awkward tension or uncomfortable murmurs, but in spontaneous applause that built into a standing ovation. People who had been sitting next to each other as strangers moments before were now exchanging glances of solidarity, some wiping away tears. Mike's own family members stepped away from him, creating a visible island of isolation around him. His sister openly wiped tears from her eyes, mouthing what appeared to be "I'm sorry" towards Steve. His father's shoulders slumped in evident shame. The opposing Johnson family, who had lost the game but were witnessing this extraordinary moment, joined the applause from their position across the stage. Mrs. Johnson, a grandmother of 5, pointed supportive fingers towards Steve while nodding emphatically. Their teenage son, who had been disappointed about their loss just minutes earlier, was now on his feet clapping with an intensity that showed the game results no longer mattered. Mike stood alone, his smirk fading as he realized his moment of planned defiance had backfired spectacularly. The cameras caught his expression changing from smugness to uncertainty to something approaching fear as the applause continued for nearly a full minute. The production team, breaking protocol, kept the cameras rolling on this unscripted moment rather than cutting to a commercial break. Later, the director would say it was the easiest decision of her career. Some moments transcend television. This was history. When the noise finally settled, Steve continued with remarkable composure that spoke to his years navigating difficult moments in the public eye. "Now, we've got a show to finish, and I'm going to do what my mama taught me back in Cleveland: treat everyone with respect, even when they don't return the favor. That's not weakness, that's strength." He turned back to the Reynolds family, who were visibly uncomfortable standing near their relative after his actions. "Congratulations on your win today. The $20,000 you've earned, your prize money, will be donated to the National Museum of African American History and Culture unless the rest of the family has any objections." Mike's father stepped forward immediately, his voice thick with emotion. "No objections here, Steve. That's perfect." His mother nodded emphatically beside him, adding, "We insist on it, actually." Mike opened his mouth as if to protest, but a sharp look from his father silenced him. The family dynamics playing out on stage added yet another layer to the already unprecedented television moment. As the credits began to roll, something extraordinary happened. The production assistants, who had worked on the show for years, later reported that audience members refused to leave when the recording complete. Signs lit up, instead forming a line to come down and shake Steve's hand personally. The scheduled next taping had to be delayed by 45 minutes as person after person waited for their chance to connect with Harvey. Security personnel, initially moving to clear the studio, stepped back when they understood what was happening. What no one knew then was that a production assistant's cell phone had captured the entire exchange from an angle different from the official camera, showing not just Steve's response, but the audience's reaction in its full emotional impact. Within hours, this unofficial footage would be uploaded to social media platforms and seen by millions around the world. By morning, it would reach tens of millions. By the following evening, it would become one of the most viewed clips in social media history. And somewhere in a suburban home, watching the footage go viral on his phone, Mike Reynolds was about to discover that actions have consequences in the digital age. By dawn the following morning, the unofficial footage had been viewed over 50 million times across platforms. The clip, captured at an angle that showed both Steve's composed response and the audience's powerful reaction, had spread with unprecedented velocity. #SteveHarveyResponse became the top trending hashtag worldwide, with celebrities, politicians, athletes, and ordinary people alike sharing the clip alongside messages of support. Major news networks ran the story in their morning broadcasts, with anchors and commentators dissecting the moment frame by frame, many calling it a masterclass in dignity and a defining cultural moment for American television. For the Reynolds family, the fallout was immediate and severe. Within hours, internet sleuths had identified Mike Reynolds as an account manager at Blackwell & Morrison, a prestigious marketing firm in Chicago, known for its inclusive workplace policies and diverse client portfolio. By noon, his company's social media accounts were flooded with comments demanding action. The firm's LinkedIn page crashed twice due to traffic volume. By 3 p.m., Blackwell & Morrison had issued a statement announcing Mike's separation from the company, effective immediately, along with a sizable donation to civil rights organizations and a commitment to mandatory sensitivity training for all employees. Mike's sister Jennifer, a third-grade teacher at Lakeside Elementary in Milwaukee with 15 years of exemplary service, posted a tearful video distancing herself from her brother's actions. The school had received dozens of calls from concerned parents questioning whether someone related to that man from Family Feud should be teaching their children. "What you saw on that stage is not how we raised him, not what we believe, and not who we are as a family," she said, her voice breaking as she sat in her classroom, surrounded by student artwork promoting kindness and inclusion. Steve Harvey showed more grace in those few seconds than most people could muster in a lifetime. "My students and I talk about choosing kindness every single day, and I've never been more disappointed in a family member." The video was shared widely, with many commenters praising her courage and transparency. The Reynolds parents, retired healthcare workers who had spent decades serving diverse communities in Detroit, disconnected their home phone after receiving numerous threatening calls. Their neighbor of 20 years, Mrs. Gladys Wilson, an 82-year-old African-American woman who had often shared Sunday dinners with the family, told a local reporter she was heartbroken but not entirely surprised by Mike's behavior. "There was always something cold in that boy, even when he was little. His parents tried their best, but some people just harbor darkness inside them." Meanwhile, at his sprawling home in Atlanta's exclusive Buckhead neighborhood, Steve Harvey was experiencing a different kind of aftermath. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the episode aired. His longtime assistant, Clarissa, had to set up a separate system just to categorize the incoming requests. Oprah called first, offering him a primetime special to discuss the incident and its implications for race relations in America. The president called next, inviting him to host a conversation on race at the White House with civil rights leaders and education specialists. Netflix, HBO, and 3 major publishing houses made competing offers for the rights to tell his life story, with figures reaching into the 8 digits. But it was the call from Marjorie, his wife of 15 years and the cornerstone of his life, that affected him most deeply. She had been visiting their grandchildren in Dallas when it happened and had seen the clip on her phone while sitting in their daughter's kitchen. "You know what made me proudest?" she said, her voice soft but certain in that way he'd come to rely on through decades of partnership. "Not what you said, though that was perfect. It was those 3 seconds before you spoke. I saw you making a choice to respond with dignity instead of anger. That's the man I married. That's the man I've watched struggle and grow and learn over all these years." Steve sat in his home office, surrounded by the evidence of a career built on making people laugh awards lining the shelves, framed photographs with celebrities and presidents, the custom suits that had become part of his brand hanging in the adjacent closet, and felt a profound shift in his purpose. Comedy had been his way into America's living rooms, his vehicle for overcoming poverty and homelessness in his early days. But perhaps this moment was showing him a different path forward. As evening fell, after hours of consultation with Marjorie, his spiritual advisor, and his closest friends, he made a decision that surprised his management team. He declined all the interview requests, the special offers, the chance to capitalize on what had become a defining cultural moment. Instead, he picked up his phone and made one call to Mike Reynolds himself. What transpired in that conversation would never be fully revealed to the public, though rumors would circulate for years. Some claimed Steve offered to help Mike get counseling, others suggested he read him the Riot Act. The truth, as is often the case, was more complex than either narrative. The call lasted exactly 47 minutes. The only detail Steve would ever confirm was that he began the conversation with the words, "I think we need to talk, man to man," and ended it by saying, "The door is open when you are ready." The following week, when Steve returned to the Family Feud stage at the Atlanta Civic Center, the atmosphere was electric. Audience members had lined up starting at 4 a.m. for the chance to be present, some holding handmade signs with messages of support. Security had been doubled. The network executives, sensing a historic television moment, had cleared an extended time slot. As the lights dimmed, and Steve walked out to thunderous applause that lasted nearly 3 minutes, the cameras caught a subtle change in his demeanor. There was a new gravitas to his presence, a depth behind his trademark smile that hadn't been there before. When the audience finally quieted, he began the show with a brief statement that had not been approved by network executives or reviewed by the legal team, a fact that would cause considerable consternation in corporate offices, but would later be recognized as a masterstroke of authentic communication. "Last week, something happened here that touched a nerve in our country," he said, looking directly into the camera with the confidence of a man who had spent decades connecting with audiences. "IV had a lot of time to reflect, and IV had some conversations that have challenged me, some of them difficult, some of them healing." He paused, adjusting his stance slightly. "What I know for sure is this. Change doesn't happen when we turn our backs on each other. It happens when we find the courage to face each other, to listen, and sometimes to forgive. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary." The audience, expecting righteous condemnation or perhaps a victory lap, sat in surprised silence, hanging on every word. I've been asked 100 times what was going through my mind in those moments. The truth is, I was thinking about my grandfather. He picked cotton in Mississippi, couldn't read or write, and faced things I can't even imagine. But he taught me that a man's dignity isn't something that can be taken, it can only be surrendered. And I wasn't about to surrender what he fought so hard to give me. Several audience members could be heard sniffling, tissue boxes being passed down rows. So today, we were going to play Family Feud. We were going to laugh together, maybe learn something together, and tomorrow we were all going to keep doing the hard work of seeing each other's humanity. That's the only way forward for all of us. As the theme music began and Steve welcomed the day's first family to the stage, a blended family from Arizona, with members representing 3 different ethnicities, the ratings counter began ticking upward at an unprecedented rate. By the end of the episode, Family Feud had recorded its highest viewership in the show's 46-year history, surpassing even special episodes featuring celebrity contestants. But the real story was just beginning to unfold in living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces across America, where millions of people were having conversations they'd previously avoided. Elementary school teachers reported using the clip, edited appropriately for young audiences, in lessons about respect. Corporate diversity trainers incorporated the incident into workshops. Religious leaders of various faiths referenced it in their sermons that weekend. And, in a small apartment in Chicago, Mike Reynolds sat alone, watching the broadcast, his phone disconnected, his social media accounts deleted, his name now synonymous with a moment of bigotry captured for posterity. The job offers that had once come easily with his MBA from Northwestern had dried up overnight. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. His dating profile, once active with matches, sat empty of responses. As he watched Steve Harvey extend his hand to the first contestant of the dia gesture so simple yet now loaded with meaning, Mike felt something shift inside him. The anger that had fueled his actions on stage began to give way to something else. Not quite remorse yet, but perhaps the beginning of recognition. Recognition that in trying to make a statement about who Steve Harvey was, he had revealed far more about himself. The path forward would not be easy or straightforward. Redemption, if it came at all, would require work and time and genuine change. But as the episode ended and Steve's final words echoed in his empty apartment, the only way forward, Mike Reynolds reached for his phone and began to compose an email that would begin with 5 difficult words: "I am ready to talk now." Meanwhile, in boardrooms across Hollywood, executives were already planning how to capitalize on what they were calling the Harvey moment. What none of them yet realized was that this wasn't just a moment, it was the beginning of a movement. The email arrived in Steve Harvey's inbox at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, forwarded by his assistant with a note. This came through the general contact form. Thought you should see it. Steve sat in his home office, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his face in the darkness. He read the 5 words at the beginning, "I am ready to talk now," and then continued through Mike Reynolds' carefully composed message. It was neither groveling nor defensive, but rather a genuine attempt at explanation and accountability. "I have spent the last week trying to understand why I did what I did," Mike had written. "The honest answer is that I was afraid. Not of you, but of a world changing faster than I could control. I used anger as a shield against that fear, and I weaponized the worst parts of myself to feel powerful. That's not an excuse, that's just the truth." Steve read the message 3 times before responding. His reply was brief: "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., my office in Atlanta. Come alone." By Friday afternoon, the 2 men sat across from each other in a conference room on the 34th floor of a downtown Atlanta skyscraper. The view stretched across the city, showing the diversity of neighborhoods that made up modern America. Steve had deliberately chosen this location, not his home, not a public place, but neutral ground with symbolic geography. Mike looked diminished somehow, as if the week of public condemnation had physically reduced him. His suit hung differently on his frame. His eyes, which had been defiant on the Family Feud stage, were now uncertain and searching. "Before we talk," Steve said, "I want you to understand something. This conversation isn't about making you feel better. It's not about forgiveness, at least not yet. It's about understanding. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer honestly." What followed was a conversation unlike anything either man had experienced. Steve, drawing on decades of interviews and human connection, asked Mike about his childhood, his family, his fears, his beliefs. He didn't let him off easy when Mike deflected or minimized, Steve pushed back. But he also listened with genuine curiosity, the kind that comes from someone who has spent a lifetime studying human nature. "My father was a union man," Mike eventually explained, his voice thick with emotion. "He worked in the auto industry for 40 years. Watched his job get outsourced, watched his pension get cut, watched everything he worked for disappear. He was angry all the time, and that anger became our family's default. It was easier than admitting we were scared. Steve nodded slowly. So you inherited his fear and called it conviction? Yes, Mike whispered. And now? Steve asked. Now I don't know who I am without it. That question and the honest admission behind it became the turning point. Steve spent the next 3 hours with Mike, not lecturing but guiding him through a process of self-examination. By the time they finished, both men were emotionally exhausted. As Mike stood to leave, Steve made an offer that would later become the most controversial decision of his career. I'm going to give you an opportunity, Steve said. But it comes with conditions. You are going to work with a therapist who specializes in deprogramming extremist ideologies. You are going to volunteer with civil rights organizations. And you are going to tell your story publicly, not for redemption, but as a cautionary tale. If you do this work genuinely, I'll support you. If you are just trying to rehabilitate your image, I'll know, and I'll make sure everyone else knows too. Mike's eyes filled with tears. Why would you do that? Because, Steve said, extending his hand in a gesture that mirrored and inverted the one that had been refused on the Family Feud stage. I believe people can change. I've spent my whole life believing that. But change requires work, and it requires accountability. Are you ready for that? Mike took his hand. I don't know, but I'm willing to try. The news of their private meeting leaked within 48 hours, causing an immediate firestorm on social media. Half the internet praised Steve for his grace and commitment to redemption. The other half condemned him for platforming a bigot and letting him off easy. Civil rights organizations released statements expressing concern. The NAACP issued a carefully worded comment that acknowledged Steve's intentions while questioning the wisdom of private reconciliation without public accountability. The Anti-Defamation League was more critical, releasing a statement that read, "While we respect Steve Harvey's commitment to dialogue, we must caution against narratives that suggest individual redemption can substitute for systemic change." Steve's social media was flooded with comments ranging from supportive to hostile. His sponsors, nervous about the controversy, began calling his management team. One major advertiser threatened to pull their multi-million-dollar deal if Steve continued to associate with Mike Reynolds. But something unexpected happened. Instead of backing down, Steve doubled down not on Mike, but on his message. He gave an interview to a major news outlet in which he articulated a vision of America that went beyond the immediate controversy. We've created a culture where people are afraid to change their minds, he said. We've made it so costly to admit you were wrong that nobody wants to try. That's not justice. That's just performance. Real justice requires the possibility of redemption. Real change requires people who are willing to do the work. The interview went viral, sparking a national conversation about accountability, redemption, and the possibility of change. Universities invited him to speak. Think tanks analyzed his statements. For the first time in his career, Steve Harvey was being discussed as a serious voice on social and political issues, not just an entertainer. Meanwhile, Mike Reynolds' redemption arc was just beginning. He started therapy with Dr. Patricia Okafor, a renowned psychologist who specialized in helping people unpack internalized prejudice and fear-based belief systems. The work was brutal. In their first session alone, Mike broke down multiple times as he confronted the ways his family's economic anxiety had been channeled into racial resentment. Dr. Okafor didn't coddle him. Your pain is real, she told him in their second session. Your family's economic struggles were real, but you chose to blame people who had nothing to do with your circumstances. That choice is on you. The question is, what choice are you going to make now? Mike began volunteering at the Community Leadership Center in Chicago, an organization dedicated to bridging racial divides through dialogue and education. His first assignment was working with at-risk youth, many of them from communities of color, helping them understand how to navigate systemic barriers. It was uncomfortable work. Many of the young people he worked with were rightfully suspicious of him. Some refused to engage with him at all. But gradually, through consistent presence and genuine effort, Mike began to build trust. He shared his story not as redemption, but as a warning. He talked about how fear and resentment had consumed him and how he was learning to examine the roots of those feelings rather than act them out. 6 months after his conversation with Steve Harvey, Mike was invited to speak at a high school in Milwaukee, his sister Jennifer's school, in fact. Jennifer had been hesitant about the invitation, worried about how it would affect her students and her own reputation. But Mike convinced her to let him try. The assembly was packed with 800 high school students, many of them curious to see the Family Feud guy in person. Mike walked onto the stage without notes, without a prepared speech. He simply told the truth. "I am here because I did something terrible," he began. "I refused to shake Steve Harvey's hand on national television because of the color of his skin. And I did it because I was afraid, not of him, but of a world I couldn't control. I used his race as an explanation for my own failures, and that was wrong." He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces. "I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. I'm here to warn you. The path I went down, the path of blaming others for your circumstances, of using fear as a justification for hatred at path, leads nowhere good. It led me to lose my job, my reputation, my family's respect. And the worst part, it didn't make me feel better, it just made me feel more alone." By the end of his talk, several students were in tears. During the Q&A, a young black student asked him directly, "Do you actually believe what you were saying, or are you just trying to fix your image?" Mike took a long moment before answering. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I think I'm trying to do both, fix my image and actually change. But I know this, if I am just performing change, it won't last." And I've decided that I want it to last. Not for me, but because I've learned what real damage I caused. That student's question and Mike's answer became the most shared clip from his talk. It spread across social media, not as a redemption story, but as an honest reckoning with the difficulty of actual change. Back at Family Feud headquarters, the show's producers were seeing unprecedented engagement. Ratings had stabilized at all-time highs. Advertisers, seeing the positive reception, had actually increased their spending rather than pulling out. The show had become more than entertainment, it had become a cultural touchstone, a place where America's values and contradictions were being worked out in real time. Steve Harvey received offers for his own talk show, documentary series, and book deals, but he turned most of them down, choosing instead to use his platform more strategically. He created a foundation dedicated to supporting dialogue initiatives in schools and communities. He partnered with universities to develop curriculum around conflict resolution and cross-cultural understanding. And he continued his relationship with Mike Reynolds, though it remained private. Once a month, they would meet for coffee or lunch, checking in on Mike's progress, discussing the challenges of genuine change, and exploring what accountability and redemption might look like in a society obsessed with quick judgments and permanent cancellations. In one of these meetings, about a year after their first conversation, Mike said something that would stay with Steve. "I realize now that you didn't forgive me that day on stage," Mike said. "You just refused to let my actions define you, and by doing that, you gave me the space to question whether my actions should define me either." Steve smiled. "That's the thing about dignity," he said. "It's not something someone else can take from you. But it's also not something you get to keep if you are not willing to extend it to others. I couldn't control what you did, but I could control how I responded. And in controlling that, I guess I was trying to show you that there's another way." "It worked," Mike said quietly. But even as Mike's personal transformation continued, the larger cultural conversation that had been sparked by that moment on the Family Feud stage was becoming increasingly complex. The story of Steve and Mike, which had initially seemed like a simple narrative of grace and redemption, was becoming something messier and more real, a window into the actual difficulty of change in a society structured by centuries of inequality. 6 months into Mike Reynolds' redemption journey, the narrative began to shift in unexpected ways. What had started as a personal story of transformation was colliding with larger systemic realities that no amount of individual change could fully address. The first crack in, The redemptive narrative came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Okafor, Mike's therapist, published an op-ed in a major newspaper titled "The Limits of Personal Redemption." In it, she wrote about the danger of allowing individual transformation stories to obscure structural inequality. When we celebrate one man's journey from bigotry to understanding, she wrote, we risk suggesting that systemic racism is primarily a problem of individual attitudes rather than institutional policies. Mike Reynolds, genuine growth is commendable, but it should not distract us from the fact that the systems that enabled his fear and resentment remain largely unchanged. The piece sparked a fierce debate. Some praised Dr. Okafor for her critical perspective. Others accused her of being ungrateful for Mike's efforts. Steve Harvey, reading the op-ed, found himself wrestling with questions he hadn't fully considered before. That evening, he called Dr. Okafor directly. I want to understand your concern better, he said without preamble. Because I believe in what Mike is doing, but I am also hearing you say it's not enough. It's not that it's not enough, Dr. Okafor replied carefully. It's that individual redemption, while valuable, can become a substitute for institutional change. When we focus all our attention on Mike's transformation, we were not asking hard questions about why someone like him felt empowered to refuse a handshake to begin with. We were not examining the economic policies that made his family vulnerable to scapegoating. We were not looking at how media and political rhetoric cultivated the fear he acted on. Steve listened intently, taking notes. So what you were saying is that my focus on dialogue and individual transformation might actually be letting the system off the hook? I am saying it's incomplete, Dr. Okafor said. And incompleteness, when it's mistaken for completion, can be harmful. That conversation marked a turning point in Steve's thinking. He began to expand his Foundation's work beyond dialogue initiatives to include policy advocacy. He started consulting with economists about the structural factors that had contributed to Mike's family's decline. He read extensively about systemic racism, not just as an individual attitude problem, but as a problem embedded in institutions in housing, education, criminal justice, and economics. Meanwhile, at the Community Leadership Center where Mike was volunteering, tensions were beginning to surface. Some staff members and participants were questioning whether Mike's presence was authentic or performative. A particularly pointed moment came when a young woman named Tasha, who had been working with Mike on a community project, confronted him directly. I appreciate what you were trying to do, Tasha said, but I need you to understand something. Your redemption arc is a luxury I don't have. I can refuse someone's handshake and then spend a year getting therapy and volunteering until people decide I'm good again. I have to navigate a world that was designed to exclude me from day one, and there's no redemption arc for that. There's just survival. Mike felt the weight of her words like a physical blow. You were right, he said simply. I know I am right, Tasha replied, not unkindly. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? That question haunted Mike. He brought it to his next session with Dr. Okafor. She's saying that my personal change doesn't actually change anything for her, Mike said, struggling to articulate his thoughts. That I can become a better person and the world will still be stacked against her. Yes, Dr. Okafor confirmed. Your transformation is about you becoming more fully human. But it doesn't automatically make the world more just for people like Tasha. Those are two different projects. So how do I bridge that gap? Mike asked. That, Dr. Okafor said, is the real work. Personal transformation is necessary but not sufficient. You have to ask yourself, what structural changes am I willing to work toward? What privileges am I willing to give up? What risks am I willing to take? Mike left that session with a new sense of purpose, but also a new sense of the magnitude of what he was being asked to do. Personal transformation had been difficult enough, but systemic change? That would require him to challenge not just his own beliefs, but the institutions and policies that benefited people like him. Meanwhile, Steve Harvey was having similar realizations. His Foundation's dialogue initiatives were valuable, but they were also, in some ways, comfortable. They allowed him to do good work without fundamentally challenging the systems that had made his success possible, that had prevented others from achieving similar success. He convened a meeting with his Foundation S board, which included civil rights leaders, economists, educators, and activists. The conversation was intense and sometimes confrontational. "Steve, your heart is in the right place," said Dr. Angela Chen, a leading economist who specialized in racial wealth gaps. "But we're spending millions on dialogue when what we should be spending money on is policy change. Dialogue is great, but it doesn't close the racial wealth gap. It doesn't fix housing discrimination. It doesn't reform the criminal justice system." "So you were saying dialogue is a waste of time?" Steve asked, not defensively but genuinely trying to understand. "I am saying it's insufficient," Dr. Chen replied, "and in some cases it can be counterproductive. When we make dialogue the primary goal, we're implicitly saying that understanding each other is more important than changing the systems that disadvantage some of us. That as a comfortable position for people with power and privilege." Steve sat with that critique for a long moment. "What would you have me do instead?" "Use your platform and your resources to push for specific policy changes," Dr. Chen said. "Push for reparations programs. Push for criminal justice reform. Push for affordable housing initiatives. Push for equitable education funding. These aren't abstract concepts, concrete changes that would materially improve people's lives." The board discussion continued for hours, and by the end, Steve had made a decision that would reshape his Foundation's work. They would continue dialogue initiatives, but they would also begin a serious policy advocacy arm. They would fund research on systemic inequality. They would support candidates and ballot measures that addressed structural racism. They would use Steve's celebrity and influence not just to make people feel good about understanding each other, but to actually change the systems that perpetuated inequality. It was a riskier position. It meant taking political stances that some would criticize. It meant potentially alienating some of his audience and sponsors. But it also felt more honest, more aligned with what he was learning about the real nature of change. The news of Steve's expanded Foundation work reached Mike Reynolds through social media, and he immediately understood the implications. If Steve was moving beyond dialogue toward systemic change, then Mike's personal redemption needed to evolve as well. He scheduled an urgent meeting with Steve. "I think I've been thinking about this wrong," Mike said without preamble when they sat down together. "I've been treating my transformation as if it's the end point. But it's actually just the beginning. The real question is, what am I going to do with my transformation? How am I going to use whatever privilege and resources I have left to actually change systems?" Steve leaned back in his chair. "That's the question I've been wrestling with too. And I don't have a clean answer, but I know it starts with being willing to be uncomfortable, to challenge people in your own circles, to risk relationships and reputation for principles." "I'm ready to do that," Mike said, "but I need help figuring out how." What emerged from that conversation was a partnership. Mike would work with Steve's Foundation, bringing his insider perspective on how privileged people think and operate. He would help develop strategies for reaching people like his former self-people, who were afraid, resentful, and looking for someone to blame. But more importantly, he would work on policy initiatives, using his business background to understand how economic and institutional change could be implemented. It was unglamorous work. There were no television moments, no viral clips, no redemption narrative to sell. It was just the slow, difficult work of trying to change systems that had been in place for centuries. But the larger culture was watching, and the story was becoming more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Some praised Steve and Mike for evolving beyond personal reconciliation toward systemic change. Others criticized them for overreaching, for using their platforms to push a political agenda. A conservative commentator wrote a scathing piece titled "Steve Harvey's Descent into Activism," arguing that his Foundation's policy work was divisive and politically motivated. A progressive activist wrote an equally critical piece titled "Steve Harvey's Performative Activism," arguing that his work didn't go far enough, and that he was still profiting from a system he claimed to want to change. Steve found himself in an uncomfortable position. He was being criticized from both sides, which suggested to him that he might be doing something right, but it also meant he was satisfying no one completely. In an interview with a thoughtful journalist, Steve was asked directly, "Do you think your work is actually changing anything?" He paused before answering. "I think we're replanting seeds," he said carefully. "Some of them will grow into real change, some of them won't. But I know that doing nothing guarantees nothing changes. So we keep working, we keep pushing, we keep trying, and we stay humble about the limits of what any one person or organization can do." The journalist followed up, "But doesn't that feel insufficient, especially when you have such a large platform?" "Of course it feels insufficient," Steve said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "It is insufficient. The problems are too big, too deep, too systemic for any one person or organization to solve. But that's not an excuse for inaction. It's a call for collective action. It's a recognition that change requires all of us doing our part, not waiting for one person to fix everything." That interview became widely shared, cited by both supporters and critics as evidence for their respective positions. But it also seemed to resonate with something deeper in the American consciousness, a recognition that real change is slow, difficult, and requires sustained commitment from many people over many years. A year after the incident on the Family Feud stage, the story had evolved from a simple narrative of grace and redemption into something far more complex, a meditation on the relationship between personal transformation and systemic change, between individual accountability and institutional reform, between the comfort of dialogue and the difficulty of real change. Mike Reynolds was no longer the villain of the story, but he wasn't exactly the hero either. He was something more interesting and more real, a person who had been forced to confront his own complicity in systems of inequality, who was doing the difficult work of changing himself, and who was beginning to understand that personal change, while necessary, was not sufficient. Steve Harvey was no longer simply the graceful victim who had responded with dignity to an insult. He was a person using his considerable platform and resources to push for systemic change, knowing that he would be criticized for it, knowing that his work was incomplete, but believing that the attempt was necessary. And the broader culture was beginning to grapple with questions that didn't have easy answers. What do we owe each other? What does accountability look like? How do we balance the possibility of redemption with the reality of systemic harm? How do we change systems while also changing hearts? These questions would continue to unfold in the months and years ahead, playing out not just in the story of Steve and Mike, but in countless other stories across the country. 18 months after the incident, investigative journalist Marcus Washington published findings showing that Steve S. Foundation had allocated less than 12% of $50 million toward actual policy advocacy, with most funds going to dialogue programs and administrative costs. Steve Harvey has built a multi-million-dollar enterprise around the language of change, Marcus wrote, while maintaining the fundamental structures that allow inequality to persist. Steve convened an emergency board meeting. Dr. Angela Chen was direct. "We've been operating within existing structures that are designed to perpetuate inequality. By taking tax deductions and maintaining corporate relationships, we're reinforcing the systems we claim to want to change." Meanwhile, Mike faced his own reckoning. When offered a $50,000 speaking fee, he consulted Tasha, the young woman who had confronted him months earlier. "Are you willing to give up the money?" she asked bluntly. "Accountability without sacrifice is just performance." Another, investigative piece by Sarah Kim exposed the redemption industrial complex, how Mike's transformation had become profitable through speaking fees, consulting contracts, and a book deal, while systemic inequality remained unchanged. Mike called Steve, "We need to talk. I think we've both been lying to ourselves." They met privately and acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Their redemption narrative had been more profitable for them than transformative for actual systems. Steve announced a major restructuring, stepping back from his foundation and committing to give away 75% of his personal wealth over 10 years, with funds going directly to policy advocacy and reparations initiatives. "Comfort is the enemy of real transformation," he stated publicly. "I was comfortable being the gracious activist, but that's not enough." Mike resigned from his consulting role and took a community organizer position at a fraction of his previous salary, establishing a fund to support people affected by the discrimination he had perpetuated. A coalition of community organizers released a pointed response. "We appreciate the resources, but their actions are still framed as individual sacrifices rather than basic justice. The question is how we build systems where inequality can exist." Steve and Mike absorbed the critique. They realized they'd been thinking about redemption as something to achieve when the real work was ongoing, accountability, without expectation of absolution. Both retreated from public view. No more viral moments, no more speaking fees, just the slow, unglamorous work of systemic change. Steve met with policy experts and community leaders. Mike knocked on doors as a community organizer, helping coordinate people around specific policy demands. Quietly, without celebration, things began to change. Housing policy reforms, criminal justice improvements, educational initiatives that closed achievement gaps. It wasn't dramatic. It wouldn't make movies or viral clips. But it was real, sustained commitment to change without expectation of recognition, without the comfort of a redemption narrative. And that, perhaps, was the most important part of the story.